everyone. Welcome to the newest episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast. Before we get into today's topic, we just wanted to share that we do have a couple spots available for a time of transition retreat in Peru this November 25th to December 1st. So if you were on the fence about coming to join us deep in the jungle of Peru, we're going to be doing yoga, qigong, meditation, having different talks, all sorts of different exercises. And we're basically going to be getting into the practical aspects of everything that we talk about on the podcast and showing you how to do that in a very embodied way and giving you all the tools that we do in order to anchor this knowledge that we speak about on the podcast into your being. So if you were on the fence about coming to join, please contact us soon because these spots do tend to fill up. And you can learn more about the retreat on Bernhard's website, veilofreality.com, or mine, lauramatsu.com. And you can fill out a form and apply there. So today's podcast is definitely a big topic, and it's a difficult question to answer, but we're going to attempt to answer it anyway. And it is, what is your relationship to the divine? So we use the divine. I like the divine because the word God has actually been so distorted that it's become such a trigger word for people. And even the divine can still be a trigger word for people as well. But we're going to be sharing about like what our relationship to God is. This a difficult question to answer, but we're going to attempt to answer it. What is God? How do we use this experience of God in aspiration and surrender? Also speaking about divine grace, building a healthy ego, how we destroy that healthy ego later, and the impact of meditation and why meditation is so important in strengthening your connection to God. So that's just a little bit of what we're going to be getting into in the first hour. And of course, this is always going to be a 2-hour podcast. The second hour you can access by joining our membership forum, where you're going to get access to all of the second hour of all of our podcasts, and also access to this amazing forum where you can share your experiences, your insights in the safe container of the forum, away from all the social media trolls and whatnot. So, yes, to begin, I'm going to ask you, what is the divine?
The ultimate question. Yeah, but as you said, we're also talking about the divine God. What is the divine God? How do we experience him, it, whatever you may want to call it? We're being confronted with the limitations of language, right? And from the Tao's perspective, the Tao that can be named is not the Tao, right? Or
if you meet the Buddha, kill him or something.
Exactly. All these koans and parables and metaphors and symbolisms, basically, that's what we're dealing with. And we are attempting to describe something that is undescribable because ultimately it's a deep inner experience.
Yeah, the mind is going to be the last to know.
Yeah, exactly. The mind is most often trying to reject it, deny it and all of that because it's coming from this very limited separative ego consciousness. But we can describe it. But again, like the saying goes, you can point at don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon, so to speak. That's another saying that ties into that in relation of describing. But we can, speak out of our own experiences and relating to various teachings and spiritual traditions we've been also working with. Now, I think let's maybe start about elements or characteristics of what the divine experience entails or what the divine is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like what I took this from Osho, that God is not a person, it's a presence. So that's the key distinction. And this is the difference between what most people know God to be. I know even myself, I didn't grow up as a Catholic or any Christian, but since that was a collective norm, I thought that God was a guy with a beard in the sky who judged you. Like, that's what I thought. I grew up around Hinduism, and it was all about, learning that you are through the person that it's about the idea like I am that was my main guru, my parents' guru's teaching. And so it was about like more this process of inquiry rather than being like, this is what God tells you should do. It was more related to that. So I was I was raised in a very unconventional religious norm, but yeah, at the same time, when I heard the word God, I thought it was a guy in the sky who judged you, and he had a beard and like a scepter or something.
White guy too.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the whole thing, is that God is actually a presence. It's an essence. When we're connected to God really deeply in our being, often, we feel joy, we feel love, we feel connection. We feel peace, we also see the meaning in everything around us. Like there is, when I've known when I've accessed the highest states of consciousness that I have, that there was no conflict between me and the outside world. Like saw everything existed exactly for the reason that it existed. And I saw the meaning in all things, and I was profoundly at peace when feeling like that. So that's the kind of state of being that I think slowly, especially through the embodiment practice, we're trying to anchor down. And so I think it starts really from the bottom up and the top down at the same time. Like there's two different approaches to doing this. So you need to clear out the vessel, meaning do your embodiment work, clear out your traumas from your body. And also at the same time, you have to illuminate the intellect and all the being and spiritualize the being. So it's like happening on two levels. And that's kind of how you merge heaven and earth. And that's at least that's my theory. We'll see what happens. So
no, but that's true. I mean, that's exactly the approach of Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga. It's a descent, to bring up, almost like the Kundalini from below, and the descent of the supramental consciousness. Let it infuse your mind, the intellect, to evolve it or clear it to the higher intellect, the intuitive mind, and purify your whole being. And in this purification process, all your shit is going to come up. Mm-hmm. That's the whole point of be as you mentioned, your wounds and traumas, this lifetime, past life, which is especially more heightened in this time of transition we're in right now. A lot of stuff is coming up, has its purpose to clear the vessel. But even beyond wounds and traumas, even our own ego stuff, right? Our ego identification, which we have talked about in the last podcast, even Reggie Ray talked, the ego itself is actually a trauma response.
Yeah.
Right? Because it lives in this illusion of separateness. And, what it then also ties into the question about talking about the divine and anchoring the divine and aligning with divine will, then who I am. When you ask the question, what is your relationship to the divine? Well, who are you?
Who am I?
Who am I?
Yeah.
That's the ultimate question. Know thyself. And I can, that's the deep self-inquiry. We also ties into meditation practices and establishing this deeper witness within that can stand outside your personality, observe yourself. And I know my own practice, when I really deeply inquired over the years of who I am, for many times I mistook that's a word,
yeah.
mistook my true self, my ego personality for my true self. The true self, again, what is the true self? Well, that is your divine self, you can say it, your higher self, your soul essence, your psychic being. That is your state, who you truly are. It is grounded in peace and joy and bliss, and not depending on any external circumstances.
Yeah.
And in my own process, when I was really deeply inquiring, who am I realized that the I who I think I am is mostly accumulated desires based on conditioning, programs, wounds, traumas, social, culturally, ancestral, this ego personality, which is simply not real.
Yeah, that's why God is also thought to be like this I am presence, because it's I am without anything after that.
Exactly. And then I remember Sri Aurobindo talking about, it's so hard to really tune into our true essence, our true soul being. And most people mistake the true self for this ego personality. What he talked about, actually, people mistake the soul for the desire soul, right?
The personality.
The personality that still has certain desires, that still wants to be fulfilled by external means, right? So one sign of the more you align with truly your divine essence is you have one established peaceful state of being. There's also this joy and bliss, and it doesn't have this, has to be this peak emotional high experience.
Yeah.
But the key point is it is not depending on any fulfillment of desires. That's why, various traditions talk about, letting go of desires. And letting go of desires has been also distorted. It doesn't mean to live an aesthetic life and denying the physical life and all of that, but this non-attachment, truly understanding. And most often, many of us on the path, well, to more or less degrees, but definitely myself, as you progress in your life, the more you realize that nothing in the outside world can truly fulfill you, right? No relationship, no job, no career, no material things, nothing.
That's the first step when Buddhists take refuge, as they basically say that, I need to figure out my own mind. I need to figure out my own suffering. I'm going to stop seeking happiness in samsara, basically. So I'm going to go within first. That's like the first step, is like you give up on the outside world making you happy, because you see that it's ever changing, that it's going to be full of, life, death, and getting old. And then you start doing the internal journey to figuring out your own mind.
Yeah, exactly. In the way that maybe has been distorted in the past, you see it in the in the Western Christian traditions, or as in Eastern tradition, the aesthetics it has turned into a denial of life, of trying to escape, even demonizing the body. Sin is flesh is sin from the Christian perspective.
Yeah.
Life is, we're born in sin. We need to reach heaven, something out there.
Yeah, but Catholicism is such an archonic.
That's like a guilt religion in itself, or the aesthetics, of denying anything in the material world and just escaping somewhere out there, beyond the body and mind, and just trying to stay in this samadhi place of this impersonal state, but not engaging in life. So there's the distortion of this truth, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And this is what created people's resistance to the word God. Like, I know when I was growing up, like, I had that experience of God, but all through my 20s, like, I thought like religion was just like basically a big joke, until I think I've spoken about this on other podcasts, in my late 20s, I had my first awakening experience where I like literally got down on my knees and prayed. What was happening there, I was basically surrendering. I was like, I can't figure out my life situation. I need help. Like, that was basically what happened. But I was surrendering to a higher power. That was the first moment when I gave up the idea that it was only my doing and my own personal will that was creating life. And I was like, I need to request help for some outside force. That's the way I related to it at first. But then I really realized it was this spark within me that just got turned back on, essentially. And I kind of got out of my own ego self, and I was like, there has to be some higher reason why I'm going through what I'm going through, basically.
Yeah. And that also ties into this necessity, deeper, sincere aspiration.
Yes.
But even like you see it in the Christian tradition, which there's a lot of truth in the Bible, but people has distorted it, making it into a dogma and whatnot. But it's exemplified in the saying, ask and knock and you shall receive. Right?
Yeah, that's what happened in that moment, because I was pretty much like, I was in such a bad situation. I was like in a relationship with a basically abusive narcissist. I was coming off of drugs. I was taking like really strong painkillers. So my body was in really rough shape. And I remember making the request, was like, to God, I was like, I will do anything you want me to do with my life if you get me out of the situation, because I was actually on the brink of like ending up on the street. It was the worst situation I've ever been in. And I'm so far from that now. But at that point, I was like basically making a deal. It was my own distorted version of like this aspiration and surrender, because I was like, I will do anything with my life from this point forward if you just get me out of this mess. And from that point forward, someone, offered me their home, and I started getting into daily yoga, and I started integrating meditation. And then years later, I'm on this completely different path that if you would have told me back then was my path. And even now, even the work I'm doing, you could have told me like a year ago that I would be doing this, and I wouldn't have believed it, because my own personal will has gotten out of the way. Especially, another note is when doing these manifestation techniques, it's often our own ego will, and we think, oh yeah, we're connecting to the universe is responding, but it's often our own ego that's creating. So now, you and I set intentions, but this whole idea of manifesting is also coming from this personal ego, will, and personality self, where we need to really surrender with whatever the flow of God is acting through us, and whatever direction we need to go next for our soul evolution. And that's extremely hard to predict.
Exactly. And then we start what the mother would say from Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga. We start to bargain with God, right? We use God to fulfill our own desires, ego desires and whatnot. And it's all about ourselves. And that ties also in people mistake soul purpose for many, many different things, right?
Yeah.
I have that myself because they mistake soul purpose for a career, for what they do, a vocation, right? Or, anything. It's actually a cultural, social construct, a job, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Right. But soul purpose in the true meaning of the word is just your purpose of the soul is basically unification with the divine in whatever way it happens.
Yeah.
And it's a constant soul purpose is a process enough, not the definition. And like you said, say exactly to you, like I realize now, and I've mentioned this in past podcasts as well, what I'm doing now, I never quote unquote planned on. It was not a career move. It just started manifesting itself or materializing in my own, based on my own process, my own inner aspiration. And then the more we then align with that, this conscious alignment or sincere aspiration with the divine and divine will, as you mentioned, you realize not only the limitation, but the illusion of personal will, right? Of trying to force things, willful doing. And it's more merging the little will, the ego, making it a vessel for divine will to act through you, individualized through you.
Yeah. And I think it's a good sign when personal will is leading the way, when things are increasingly difficult. Not to say that you're not going to have difficulties in your life, but it's almost like you're swimming upstream and you're also going through the same stuff over and over again. I feel like that's usually because your wounded personality self is in control. Because once you start aligning with divine will, like you'll start cycling through karma pretty fast. At least in my own experience, it may be really uncomfortable for the ego to go through it because a lot of stuff around you will change in a short period. But you're going to be accessing more of these higher states like joy, bliss, etc.
That contentment. And it's also exactly in this aspiration that also requires a surrender. And that's again, surrender, the word has also been misunderstood, misused. And it's even, I remember Sri Aurobindo talking about it, that the American definition of the word surrender is not the accurate translation of the, true meaning of what it means from a spiritual perspective to surrender to the divine, because it's not a passive thing. It's not you're just like, I'm surrendering to the divine and there's non-action, just being here in samadhi, don't do anything. Surrender is more, it's actually an active state to let a higher force, this true force, the divine force, act through you and use you as a vessel, and then action becomes even more powerful.
Yeah, and exactly. And that surrender, I find, is very often accompanied with devotion. Like, unless you actually have, it's about this relationship as well. Unless you have really devotion to your true self and devotion to the connection to God that is connected within you, then that surrender is not going to be very easy, because you'll be like, the ego is always thinking like, what's in it for me, etc. Exactly.
That's I want to note that, because like you mentioned at the beginning, I also want to address that the word divine, especially God, was definitely triggering for me, at the beginning of my spiritual path. And personally speaking, I definitely had a different upbringing than you, but I was also not religiously brought up. My dad is a scientist, atheist, doesn't really believe in God. And my mom, was raised as a Protestant in Germany, but it was more because of social customs. We went to church once a year for Christmas because everybody else did.
You didn't have any like profound experiences there or anything?
At church?
Yeah.
No. I was just, I read the Bible and everything, even school. And for me, I was like reading an adventure book. Like I was like, oh, who's this Jesus guy? But and also the way I also got impressed by it, the impression that there's this outside God that judges me.
Yeah, even in Jesus, it's like, oh, Jesus is the best. And
yeah. I mean, this whole this a lot of these, for me, these are, I realize, metaphors not to be taken literal, right? But I've known what I remember now, even though my mom wasn't the full religious person, but I remember when I did something wrong here and there, then my mom said, God will punish you for that. She used that against me,
Yeah.
So that kind of even, I wasn't definitely didn't get the Catholic guilt programming intensely.
But you still had it.
But I still had through these little remarks.
Yeah.
That there's, okay, I'm not only just getting punished by my parents, but by some invisible person.
That's interesting, because that was one thing, because my mom grew up in I think similar, like Protestant or Anglican, I don't know, they're all the same to me, but that's one thing she didn't do, is like tell me that's like I don't have as much of a guilt and shame program as other people. Even when I was doing things that people classically guilt and shame other people doing, like shooting up drugs, for instance, I didn't feel as much guilt and shame around it. I did feel some, obviously, because of what I was doing to my body, but I was absent of that program because I didn't grow up in that environment as much. It didn't exist, like, because that's what my mom learned from being in like her own, version of Christianity, whatever that was, that was really harmful, and then she also there's also never mind the old predators and the priesthood and whatnot. And there's like a very high incidence of sexual abuse with children happening in Catholicism, which I think also points to the fact that there's some huge distortion coming through that. And, this is also all of organized religion, by the way, just as a side note, what you're speaking of, I remember Reggie Ray talking about the cities who were part of his lineage, basically. What happened is they joined the monastery and they were like, screw this, we're going to become regular people again. And they basically abandoned the monastery and became householders, meaning they worked jobs, had children. And that's where the true tantric traditions blossomed, is like they left the monastery and they were like, no, if we can only find God in these places, then it's actually not real. We have to find it in everyday life.
Exactly. The same you see in, I think this is these days are over, that you have to go to a cathedral or church to connect with God.
Oh, no, they're still happening.
Yeah, still happening. I know, but, I feel there's a certain awareness rising, in
our circles.
Separating religion from spirituality from religion.
Yeah.
Right. But, or having to go through a middleman, the priest, the pope, whatever.
Yeah.
Right. And all of that. So in my upbringing, over the past 20 years in my journey, as I got deep into self-work and on all levels, and then engaging in spiritual work. So at some point you're naturally confronted with your relationship to the divine and God, and for me, it took a big turn for me. Well, let me backtrack. I realized now, looking back, even my childhood or early adolescent life, especially my musician years, playing drama, making music, I had experiences of the divine, right? Like this that dissolution of the ego, I personality, and this installment of or experience of deeper bliss and love and joy and timelessness, especially being around in nature, or when I was playing music, making art, or playing drums. I had these experiences of there's something deeper within me. There's something truer within me. And obviously I had these experiences on psychedelics back then as well, as, mushrooms, DMT, but it was nothing permanent, obviously. And these experiences have increased more, actually, the more I was working on myself, doing shadow work, doing my trauma work, wounding, what we said just at the beginning, to clear the vessel, right? To establish that connection more and more to something higher that is not related to anything we can think of. And the mind always likes to interfere and gets triggered and likes to deny, because the ego personality, and then infused by the anti-divine occult forces, they also want to keep us in the separateness state of being, disconnected from who we truly are, right? But I remember the trigger came up again for me when I got deeper into integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo the Mother 5 years ago, and started diving into the work. And he talked about the necessity to aspire and surrender to the divine, and the word divine triggered me. And even my meditations, what you shared, when my meditations, the beginning, I'm going to surrender, surrender to the divine, and then my mind is trying to make some sort of abstract,
what that looks like,
what does it look, and what's going on there, and that's the mind will never get it. It will actually actively resist and deny it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then even I noticed that surrender to the divine will, my ego would hold on, I don't want to surrender. I don't want to give up my sovereignty. What are you surrendering to? I want what I want. I'm not going to give this up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So all of that. But then I realized on the deeper level that this was not my true self speaking. There was an active resistance of my lower nature, of my egoic self, infused by occult forces and all of that. So it really, the first step to really truly, experience the divine is also coming into this place of stillness. That's why I feel for a consistent meditation practice is very important to get out of this mind chatter, the monkey mind, that the surface consciousness we're constantly in.
Yeah.
Right? And dive deeper, deeper, deeper. And then there's this presence that emerges itself through coming more in contact, what Sri Aurobindo would call the psychic being, your soul or your higher self. And that's the expression of the divine coming through you.
Yeah, that's what happened to me when I actually moved from a big city to being in nature. And then since I hadn't lived in nature for so long, I would just get so captivated by the immense beauty of being out there that it brought me to a full state of presence. You know, I also had my meditation practice, which definitely deepened when I was in nature. But it's that presence. If your mind is making up a story about what someone said to you yesterday, then you're not going to be able to experience that. It has to be experienced in a state of presence. And then, and even like through my meditation practice, I think I told you this many times, but there was a specific moment, and I'll remember it forever, where all of a sudden, because I used to have a constant dialogue going in my head, like my mind works very quickly. And all of a sudden it was like I was at a party and everyone just left all of a sudden. So that voice calmed down, and I still have thoughts, but it's not constant chatter that it used to go on before. And I think that constant chatter is actually what most people are dealing with as well. So if you can actually bring people into a state of presence by like attuning to them and seeing that spark in them, you can actually also connect them more to God as well through our own ability to be present to other people. That's when we start experiencing more of that. Like it's such a fundamental part of it. And I think in that stage as well, like I was basically in my escaping the world stage, which I think, by the way, is not to be thrown out. Like I was still engaging in the world. It's really hard to escape the world these days, to be honest, because we've become so dependent on the conveniences in the modern world. But I needed to go into that period of like meditation alone in the forest. You know, I wasn't entirely alone, but I was pretty isolated, I have to say, in order to really anchor that connection more and more and more. And then, yeah, like over the years as I've meditated, I've noticed my ability to stay present is longer. And I feel it more deeply as well. Like if I'm talking to someone, it's especially if I'm doing sessions, it's very rare that I'm going to have a conversation going on in my head at the same time, which I think is why it's really important, especially when we choose someone to work with, like a therapist or a coach or whatever. If they don't have their own spiritual practice, then they're not really able to be present for you, I feel. Like I know a lot of therapists, they kind of do the top-down approach, like changing your cognition and changing your thoughts and engaging with your stories. But really what we want someone to do is like truly see us and hear us and be present with us. And that allows a true self to emerge.
Yeah. So, which, you know, we can maybe on that note talk about our personal practices. And it's also important to understand on that note that, you know, coming in touch with the divine, your inner presence and divine will and all of that, God, is not just reduced to the practice itself.
No.
Right? It essentially needs to, like you mentioned, like seen in life, in everyday life. And it's not about escaping life or trying to avoid it. Avoid life, you know. Before I get into that, just something else came into me to want to speak about, because we mentioned at the beginning the distortion of God and divine in regards to dogmatic traditions of escaping life, right? Reaching heaven, the ascetics or the Catholics, right? Denying the physical world and all of that. This is Maya, this is an illusion. But there needs to be reversal. We need to anchor and spiritualize our being in the world and embrace life, right? To spiritualize the world. Interestingly, I see the same pattern of these old dogmatic religions in the New Age Ascension community or fringe community, who claim, you know, even when people talk about similar stuff, I talk about the matrix control system, hyperdimensional matrix, and that has overtaken humanity and this planet, and this is a prison planet, right? And even to the point of that claiming that the tunnel of light is a trap and the reincarnation cycle is a trap and we need to get out of it and not reincarnate, and like trying to escape the world, basically. You know, this whole, which I realized all these theories actually infused by the predator, occult, hostile forces themselves.
And in the
as
truth
well.
movement, I don't hear them talk about like God or anything.
No. That's many of them.
They're mostly atheists.
Many atheists, especially anarchists, no relationship.
Yeah.
That's what I see. You know, there's the baby being thrown out of the bathwater. Not many people have actually deeper spiritual practice. But interestingly, I see the same mindset about ascension, escaping the world, getting away, getting out of here.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's the same approach like the aesthetics or even the Catholics. Like, we need to reach heaven. This world sucks, or this is sin, this is evil.
And by the way, that's also a red flag whenever you see the New Age people be like, oh, I'm ascending. I've reached 5D, now 60, now 90, now 11D.
You know what? Sorry, go ahead.
Because what I've noticed just in my own experience, because I've accessed states of consciousness that are way above my regular range, you know, and that just shows me how much more work I have to do, because it's about anchoring that down. And yes, we can touch these peak states or peak experiences, but the reason that they're peak experiences is because our normal baseline is actually quite low.
Exactly. Yeah. That reminds me of what Adyashanti said, that we don't need to seek out altered states of consciousness, because we are in an altered state of consciousness already. Right? This is not who we truly are.
Exactly.
But going back, that's what I come to realize too. This whole, especially nowadays, moment where people talking about ascension into 5D, 60, 70, this ascension process, right? And I realized this is not how this process works. It's not about ascending. And even I've used the word ascension as well, but always in quotation marks, because it's not about ascending somewhere else. In the end, it's about bringing down the descent and ascent at the same time, to anchor the divine force in the body as the vehicle for quote unquote ascension to a high state of being. It doesn't mean we are going into some, all these New Age ideas of people throw these words around, 5D, 60, 70. They just become like, without picked it up somewhere, and then they become memes almost.
Yeah.
Right. And it has a lot of spiritual bypassing. And typically very ungrounded people, by the way. I'm making a generalization, but typically. Definitely. Right. When there's actually, again, it's not about escaping this world, not about ascending into some other reality or dimension. It's like, no, we're bringing it down here into the world, into our bodies, and embracing life more fully. Right.
Yeah.
So, that's just almost on the side now. That could be a topic on its own. But I see this, again, a lot of what I see in the New Age or in the fringe movement about trying to escape this planet, this matrix, is no different what the aesthetics did in India, or the Catholics, dogmatic Catholic Christians of, seeing that, we are born in sin and we need to go upward somewhere into heaven and not come back here.
That's what also Buddha did before he started teaching people meditation. He was one of those ascetics. He used to like meditate in graveyards and do the whole aesthetic thing for a while. And then through, I don't know, from the time he came enlightened, I suppose, he was just engaging the world, just teaching people meditation. So I feel like there's a point, where people try those kinds of things, and they try like abandoning, on the more extreme New Age things, people become breatharians, they try and get as grounded as possible, and then they need to anchor themselves back down.
They're trying to forcefully achieve a state.
Yeah, which, by the way, it reminds me, I think we've said this on other podcasts, but Reggie Ray has this great quote. He's like, when you think, it's in regards to your own spiritual process, when you think something is happening in your spiritual process, nothing is happening. And when you think something is nothing is happening, that's when something is happening.
Yeah, because I think also what people ask, I remember that we had this discussion on one of our Zoom calls with the membership group on the forum. People had talked about, well, how do you experience the divine? And people think that's just this, this higher bliss, enlightened state of full ecstasies and angels playing harps next to you and all of that. Mm-hmm. And there can be sometimes peak experiences, but for my own personal experience, it's very subtle. It's more a subtle experience beyond the mind, beyond the five senses, of really recognizing the interrelationship of it all, to really on an embodied level know, not intellect, that there's nothing wrong with reality and everything has its place. And I'm not saying this as a New Age cop-out, but it's a deeper inner experience, right? That there's something else working itself out, and understanding that the limitations of my perceptions and ego, what I divide between good and bad, and all of that, not underseeing, not even coming close to understanding the bigger picture of what is anchoring itself here, right? What is truly happening. And also But I've talked about the role of evil and these forces that have a teaching function and the play of duality. So it's more this recognition on a deeper level, and then actually truly seeing God, the divine, in other people. And I've experienced it, like we experience in our relationship, but I experience this in daily life sometimes when I truly intuit out of my mind, embodied, not only in body, but connected to my essence. Look into other people's eyes and I see the divine spark in them as an expression of the divine. I see this a lot, especially when I work with clients one-on-one after, when I do body work, there's a deeper connection, like you are me, I am you, right? And you can see through the appearances, through the crust, through the wounds and traumas, and there's a deeper recognition on beyond the five senses, right? And that's, for me, the experience of the divine, and it also manifests in synchronicities. I even see this in what we call people who are asleep, or quote unquote simple people in everyday life. The person, at the grocery store checks out my food, or whenever we go, like this, when you can drop into that, if you get out of, if you're able to get out of your ego separative consciousness.
Yeah, because I think what you're alluding to is just a state of being, and I think especially I think what people are mistaking for like this higher spiritual awakening happening, because so many people are interested in spirituality. What I see personally is actually there's a lot of spiritual materialism happening there, and a lot of people's egos getting caught up in spirituality. That's just what I see. Maybe that's a projection from within me, but I don't like true spirituality. I feel I've seen a higher level of being in people who have no spiritual practice. You never know where you're going to find it. And especially randomly, I'll see, I've noticed if I make eye contact with people who are like begging the street for money, often because they've basically surrendered in a way, there can be a high level of presence and being there as well. But I just wanted to, what you just said about, it's not about becoming something out there. I wanted to quote Reggie Ray's quote when he's referring to Tantra, like true Tantric, not this Neo-Tantra where you have sex parties and engage with strangers, but true Tantra is using all of reality as a spiritual process, basically, like engaging.
Just saying real quick, because that's important, because nowadays the word tantra is literally equated with sex or sexuality. That's a distortion, but that happened for a reason, I'm sure. But okay, so it's two quotes together, and we're just going to read them together. Tantra is found in the raw human emotions. It's found in the meltdowns. It's found in the incredible, painful disruptions we have with the people we love. It's found in the earth under us. The important part is that spirituality, as it's viewed in the tantric tradition, is not about becoming someone higher, bigger, or better. It's not a self-improvement technique. That's a key thing. It's not about figuring out a way to get rid of unwanted parts of our personality. It's not about becoming peaceful. It's not about becoming kind and loving to everybody, although that is the end result. Tantra is about letting go of all of our attempts to try to change ourselves. It's about surrendering to everything we are and being willing to be one with it. And that's also how we go through this process of transmutation in our emotions. The more that we try and deny our anger, which is what a lot of these religions are about, like denial, the more we're actually not allowing that transmutation process to come forward. And they talk about that in, a lot of trauma resolution is like, you have to feel it in order to heal it. So the more that we're being like, oh, we shouldn't be this and this and this, a spiritual person isn't this way. That's actually the gateway that we need to enter to embody more compassion for ourselves and the human experience. Yeah. Exactly. Beautiful. Very beautifully said, to bring it out into everyday life, not to escape life. I also noticed the more I come in touch with my true essence, you can call it the divine, to this internal alignment, the more I naturally embrace life, and I don't fight the world anymore, right? It's almost like being more, you can see it from any other tradition, or like the Taoist tradition, being more flowing in the rhythm of life, the Tao, right? Like you're like a martial artist, gracefully embracing life. It doesn't mean that, excuse me, it doesn't mean that there won't be any challenges happening, but you're more like Bruce Lee said, become like water, right? You're able to dance with life and whatever it brings at you, knowing that everything, whatever you're being confronted with as a challenge, is also a deeper lesson for your own soul evolution. So you naturally embrace life. You don't resist it anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And you also make decisions from a wiser perspective, not, because of your own sincere inner work, coming of alignment, who you truly are, your decisions. Even your wants, needs, and desires are not coming from this wounded or traumatized self. It's trying this lack within, trying to fulfill something by external means, right? And hence you're not pushing your will onto the world via willful doing. Like you said, we are similar to you and I, we have certain intentions and dreams in our lives and whatnot, but it's coming with this more unattached intention, right? Working with that rather than forcefully trying to manifest, forcefully trying to reach a goal with this ambition behind it.
Yeah.
That's another thing. If
you're meditating with an ambition. And
that's like self-defeating in itself.
Although I did that at a point because I was just so desperate to kind of calm my mind down. But it's only in those moments where I was just kind of doing it and not having an intention for it that I had the most profound experiences. So did you want to read a quote? Or
That writes my own quote, something I wrote. But that relates to that, there's something I wrote in an essay, so maybe some listeners may be familiar with that, and I call it, which I've realized through my own experiences, that's basically signs that you're becoming more aligned with the divine will, which is also your true essence, right? Your true self. And it ties in what we just said. One, ambition, vital desires like desires, passions, or whatnot, based mostly on wounds and conditioning. Ambition, vanity, the need for attention, to be liked or desired, the notion and pressure to become something or someone, any comparison, competition with others, or even dislike of others, all fall slowly away, as do any triggers and reactive behaviors, right? Because that's your true being, your true essence is full within itself, right? It doesn't need outside, confirmation, so to speak.
Yeah.
Second one, a deep and embodied sense of peace, trust, of faith, and being taken care of, and as in trusting in the flow of life, knowing that any challenge that will come up serves as a deeper lesson for the purpose of a true awakening. That's what I mentioned before. You're not fighting the world. You're not getting into anxiety, worry, or fear because when the ego is in charge, it always sees everything as a threat.
Yeah, it's fearful.
Fear of death, right?
It's fear of everything.
Exactly. And then it goes to the next point. It's the end of fear and blame, the death of ego identification, and the rebirth of the real I am, embodied spirit, soul, individualized, and expressing itself uniquely through you, connected to all that is. Then willful doing dissipates, to be replaced by an embodied responding to what is and what life brings that is uniquely tuned to your soul lessons and talents. It guides you from an embodied inner place without expectations and attachments to outcome. And like I just said before, goal setting and ambition are replaced with a quiet aspiration with intention, but without expectations or need to control. Making choices and decisions don't stem from a thought process anymore, any head-centric analysis of should or shouldn't, but emerge from a gut level of non-verbal intuitive knowing, deeply tuned in with your soul and the divine. Which also reminds me, expression of becoming more in alignment with the divine, your true self, is also this spontaneity. Right? Yeah. And spontaneity, not just reckless, like I'm doing whatever here and there, driven by your passions, right?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
There's
something different.
Yeah.
There's a deeper.
Yeah, that's not spontaneity though. That's like you're driven by almost your animal nature more than anything now.
Yeah. And then life becomes like a dance in the river of life, as we don't find the current anymore, being zoned and locked in the rhythm of life, the Tao, aligned with divine will.
Yeah.
So these are some aspects I've experienced in myself, and it's not easy. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm always aligned completely in that flow.
Yeah.
Right. My own stuff comes up, my triggers. Sometimes, I'm better aligned than other. I'm not enlightened. Right.
Yeah, I've only been in that state that I know of once completely with my whole being. And I remember this is so cliche, but this was what happened to me. There was this like cave outside Rishikesh where these enlightened sages went to go meditate. And it's a high spiritual hotspot. Any place where the people were meditating for a really long time, you start building up the energy there. but I think it was like 2 hours of meditation I did there. I had like a cab driver who drove me there and just waited outside the cave for me, essentially like up the path. And then I remember like in my meditation, I can't even describe it, but it was basically like all my nadis were unlocking. Like there was some weird rearranging of my assemblage points, I guess you could say. And I didn't actually feel anything in the meditation, but then when I went out in the world, I was profoundly at peace with everything. There was like no resistance. I saw the meaning behind everything without even being able to tell you what it was, like, but just this profound sense of peace and appreciation and love for everything. And because I was so used to my own like ego being in control, I remember my ego was getting in the way of just embracing the experience and being like, how are you going to manage being in the world like this? How are you going to get everything down? It's like my super ego came down, and this is just my own state of being that was in my body, but my own super ego was still judging it. And I've experienced before that super ego coming in and kind of judging the experience is often what kicks you out of it as well. Or another thing will come in and it'll be like, oh my God, I'm so enlightened now. I'm so much better than other people. That's another thing that comes in as well.
The ego hijacking these experiences, right?
Exactly. But that, I think in my process there, because I was really sincere and I was like, okay, I'm going to go meditate, in this place, in this certain ashram, which had really good energy. And I was really sincere in my process. And that was one moment, in exactly the moment when I felt it shouldn't have came, I was actually hit by my first really profound experience of divine grace. And I've told this story to you, but I want to tell it to the podcast listeners is, so at ashrams, you're not supposed to smoke weed and go in there. It's just like a rule that exists, But I found in my hostel that I was staying at before I was staying in this ashram, this guy who was selling hash. And I was like, so I got some and I smoked hash and I went to the ashram to meditate. And right when I was about to enter the room of basically the guru who had left his body, I felt this energy being like, don't enter. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to go in. It was very strong, almost like a psychic force field. And so I didn't go in. I went outside his room to meditate anyway, and I started listening to the Gayatri mantra, which we've played at our retreat as well, and it's a very powerful version of this song. That's actually, I found out, was the mantra of that ashram. So I was listening to that mantra, and I was also, just whispering it to myself, and all of a sudden I actually felt that energy of the guru in front of me. And and at that moment, it was like I was instantly forgiven for everything wrong that I ever thought I did, including my own judgments about smoking pot. And I really realized it was only my own judgments that were creating that, and that nothing was wrong. And that that's all, the only way I can describe it is being like, imagine feeling in a completely embodied way, instantly forgiven for everything that you think you've done wrong. Because from the perspective of God, that's actually how it is. Like even the person who's the murderer, the mass murderer in solitary confinement, from a God perspective, God has already forgiven them. That's how I feel. So that was extremely profound. And I just was like sobbing the entire time. And it was probably my most intense experience of God. And it made me realize how much the mind and our own super ego judges ourselves for things. I think that also comes from maybe this long tradition of shaming ourselves for things that we do and saying that there's right and wrong. Obviously there are actions that can bring forward more positive experience in our life, but it is all a lesson on the greater perspective. And we give ourselves the hardest time, actually.
Exactly. I mean, in the sense, even the Zen perspective, they say thought is the source of all suffering, right? And especially our internal dialogue, be it even infused by occult forces injected. These are not even our own thoughts. We have picked up, from childhood, our parental stuff, society, and our own internal critic, which is not who we truly are. We have to keep this in mind. That's why also when you work with people, there's this aspect of rejection as well, which has its place. And Shri Aurobindo talked with the triple transformation of aspiration, rejection, and surrender. Aspiration to the divine, rejection of our lower nature, and surrender to the divine.
And I think that's also just rejection of the outside influences that do not support our spiritual path.
Reject, because it can be tricky. You don't want to fall rejection. You don't want to fall into the trap of the aesthetics of suppression
or just
and denial.
Allowing your own ignorance, being like, oh, I'm just going to forget that or something.
Exactly. But rejection of sometimes these thoughts come in, the inner critic, because your true self would not have negative thoughts about yourself.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And you also have the discipline. It's like if you don't reject certain impulses in you're often a very undisciplined mind. Like if I'm like, oh, I'm going to go look at something that I know is going to be damaging to me, like watch some violent TV show. I don't watch violent TV shows, just an example. You have that thought. If you don't learn how to reject that thought.
Reject also these impulses, these vital impulses like the desires, what we're drawn to. It's driven by our lower nature, very mechanical.
Yeah, the ego is also very impulsive. That's how
ego. And then, sexual energy, when it comes from a lower nature, that can, people are driven. That's why, people watch porn, for example.
Yeah, that's why this ability of self-observation is really important, to just observe your thought and then also use your higher knowledge. So, if you have this impulse to do something, use this witness to actually work through it, and that's how we can kind of start discerning what will be help us on the path and what may kind of derail us a little bit. Because we can make our job, not our job, but we can make our journey go much slower if we keep repeating the same.
Exactly. I mean, any form of deeper spiritual practice, even yoga in itself, like Shri Aurobindo said, life is yoga, all is yoga. It's a whole new way of existing, and to catalyze your own spiritual awakening or process, right? That's the whole point of a spiritual practice in a sense, but you cannot skip any steps, what I'm saying. But, that's why in terms of what you just mentioned, the importance is to establish the witness, the observer. That's why this comes into the question again, a very important question on the path, what we mentioned in the beginning: who am I? Know thyself. Who's my true self? And like I said, most people, myself included, are on the journey mistake all kinds of ego identification, wants, needs, and desires for a true self, which is not who we truly are. But then you want to dive deeper through, all these practices, but also basic psychotherapeutic somatic work to work through your wounds and traumas, to connect to essence, but especially stilling your mind, consistent meditation practice to be able to step outside yourself, to observe your different parts, your mentals, your thoughts, your vital emotional desires, your physical impressions in your body. Then we can come closer to who we truly are and make wiser decisions in our lives. And just the awareness alone initiates certain changes within the being.
Yeah. And I saw this image once. I wish I saved it, but even if I saved it, I had so many iPhones, I wouldn't have it by now. But anyway, so it had an image of the monkey mind. And so it was like several images of a man with a monkey. And at first the monkey, it was this man and he had the monkey and he was totally taking over his head, like totally covering it. And then slowly the monkey moves to his back, and then slowly he kind of is holding on to his back. And then eventually the guy is walking with the monkey on a leash behind it. And that's kind of how our relationship with our monkey mind develops over the process of meditation. Most people who have zero meditation practice, I'm saying most people, not all people, because I've met people who actually have a high state of being, who are very simple people who probably don't meditate at all, but their life is a meditation. Right. Especially people who have to work with nature a lot of the time. Like if you're working in a garden, for the most part, like you have to be present, or else if you don't be present, you're going to mess up something, and then your whole crop is going to go to waste. So a lot of people who actually work, I've noticed, especially people who work as farmers, like this is a way that they have to be present. Like you just have to be, because you're connected to something and you have to be aware of what you're doing in the moment. But for most of us who live in the modern world, especially because we've been taught through a lot of our academic conditioning to really strengthen the mind, that the mind is like going in chaos all the time. And not only that, never mind our technology and all the news that we're subjected to all the time. So for the most part, like people have this constant dialogue going in their head, and it's like the monkey, or maybe even multiple monkeys, are like running the show. It's just like jumping from thought to thought to thought. And it's not to, demonize this process, because it's just an aspect of how, when the mind starts quickening, it works. Like, especially I notice, for myself, if I were to not meditate for a few days, I do notice my mind gets very ADD, and that's kind of that's also the condition of like when we're uncomfortable as well, we just jump from thing to thing to thing because something's actually going on in the body and we're trying to ignore it. And I also feel like this meditation process is evolving over time. Before, it was I've heard of a lot of meditations. It's like focus on the third eye, focus on mantras. That's all well and good, but now I'm noticing more of a trend of somatic meditation and working with the body. And I think that we're more moving into this phase of like earth-based spirituality. Because if you also, I've noticed, this is obviously also a generalization, but many indigenous people, what we value in them is their state of presence. Like they're very grounded, present people, typically, even if they have no spiritual practice at all. It's just in their lineage because their ancestors were working with the elements. They're working in tune with nature. They're not that as far removed as some of us. So I think this is more what we're trying to anchor here on Earth, is being able to work in tune with nature again and trust our intuition and trust the information we're getting from the environment, because that's also our alignment with the divine, is when we're able to like translate everything that is through our body as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Well, now as we getting closer to the end of the first hour, yeah, definitely in the second hour, I would like to get more into also getting into more practical advice with regards to a consistent spiritual meditation practice. We can share more what we do personally, but also on recognizing that's an individual process.
Yeah,
I will take on later on. Also, it's very important to understand the actual necessity to build a healthy ego first before we can surrender to the divine, because that's missing in our Western civilization as well. A lot of people deal with a very low self-esteem, low sense of self-love, insecurities, wounds and traumas, who, we can almost bypass a necessary process of healthy ego creation before we can truly surrender to the divine. And Sri Aurobindo talked about this, Gurdjieff as well. Like you need to, or what is the quote by Carl Jung?
The first half of it's something I'm paraphrasing, but something like the first half of your life is related to building a healthy ego, and the second half is destroying it, or something along those lines.
Yeah, but there's truth in that. There's a paradox, but there's truth to that.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. And then I want to talk about what I've, basically found out to be the 4 steps of holistic inner work. I want to go deep into that. I'm actually writing an essay about that as well, that relates to physical, mental, psychological, and spiritual work. And obviously the current times we're in right now, and also, again, the anti-divine forces or call forces, because here's the thing, people ask so much about protection against these forces, what we can do and all of that. The only place they cannot be touched by these forces is your true self, your psychic being, your alignment with the divine.
Oh,
that's and any esoteric tradition talks exactly about that. So that's your own protection. But I see again so many people, and I'm not taking myself out of the equation, especially in the past, are resistant to this true surrender to the divine and what that means, and that aspiration. We want to talk about the world in all of that, what's going on, what are the solutions, but no, the solution is right here in front of us. And so, and that it relates to coming to terms with God and the divine, and what does it mean, our relationship, and anchoring that force within us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And that also reminds me, I also want to touch on something Gabor Mate said about our childhood traumas as well, and why, as long as we try and blame how we felt on our parents or whatever, we're going to still externalize our problems for out there. But the true trauma that happened is we lost connection to our true self and essence.
Exactly.
And so if we look at it that way, then we can always actually get that back. We don't have to wait until our parents somehow wake up, or if they're dead, it's unfortunate. It's not going to happen, but that's how we can take full self-responsibility as well.
You can even tie it into genetic modification of humanity, the alien intervention, whatnot, which has its place in the biggest evolution of consciousness, the bigger picture. Nothing is being done to us. You know what I mean? It's all these are lessons in the sense. But, like this original trauma of disconnecting us from who we truly are, right? Through this modification and whatnot. So we're finding our way back home, or to a higher spiritualized being. But I want to quote at the end the mother, Sri Aurobindo's partner from Integral Yoga, and hinting at what I just mentioned before. We're in this intense time. There's a lot of darkness coming up, which has its place, the Kali Yuga, and so much stuff happening. And people ask, what should we do? And we have, most of us people are fighting shadows on the wall in the 3D world, the atrocities and all of that. But the solution is right here if we would be willing to surrender to it. So she writes, at the moment, we are at a decisive turning point in the history of the earth, once again. From every side I'm asked, what is going to happen? Everywhere there's anguish, expectation, fear. What is going to happen? There's only one reply. If only man could consent to be spiritualized. And perhaps it would be enough if some individuals become pure gold, for this would enough to change the course of events. We are faced with this necessity in a very urgent way. This courage, this heroism, which the divine wants of us, why not use it to fight against our own difficulties, one's own imperfections, one's own obscurities? Why not heroically face the furnace of inner purification, so that it does not become necessary to pass once more through one of those terrible, gigantic destructions which plunge an entire civilization into darkness? This is the problem before us. It is for each one to solve in his own way. And that's really what it comes down to. We have seen this in ancient civilization, Atlantis, Lemuria, and whatnot. If we don't heed the voice of the divine, really, and truly like do what is necessary within ourselves to purify ourselves, to anchor the divine and surrender to this divine force, right, and understand that all the dogmatic views of religious views of God and divine has also been programmed by us, conditioned by these occult forces, by not trusting us, by strengthening our ego personality.
And strengthening our need for the external to
tell
us what to do.
And external, and then looking for external guidance, looking for the savior, the leader, trying to blame constantly the outside world and other people, and that feeds what I've talked about before, the matrix agenda or frequency of divide and conquer. So alignment with the divine, surrender to the divine, is the quote-unquote the way out for your own quote-unquote salvation in the world, right? But it's an internal process. So you have anything else to say before we close the first hour?
No, that's it. And once again, for the second hour, join our membership forum, and we can also discuss more about this podcast on there.
Yes, and you can join at veilofreality.com. See you guys at the second hour.